Sometimes the most important moment of your life begins with a conversation that was never meant to happen. I didn't know that on a rainy Thursday evening in downtown Seattle. I didn't know that a woman I had never met was about to change the way I looked at love, trust, and second chances. All I knew was that I was standing outside the restroom of a small Italian restaurant, waiting for a business call to end, when I heard someone quietly crying on the other side of the door. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of crying people do when they're trying very hard not to let anyone hear. I froze for a second, suddenly feeling like an accidental witness to something deeply personal. A few moments later, the sound stopped. Silence filled the hallway. Then the door opened. A woman stepped out, quickly wiping beneath her eyes before looking up. For a brief second, our eyes met. She immediately looked away, embarrassed that someone had noticed. I looked away too, pretending I hadn't heard anything. She walked past me toward the front of the restaurant, her shoulders stiff as if she were carrying an invisible weight. I should have forgotten about it right there. Most people would have. But something about the sadness on her face stayed with me. I finished my call and headed back toward the dining area. The restaurant was busy for a weeknight. Soft music played through hidden speakers, and conversations blended together beneath the warm yellow lights. As I walked past the tables, I noticed her again. She was sitting alone near the front window. A half-finished glass of water sat in front of her. Across from her was an empty chair. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't eating. She was just staring out at the rain sliding down the glass. There was something heartbreaking about how alone she looked in a room full of people. I found myself glancing over more than once while waiting for my takeout order. That's when I noticed another detail. There were two menus on the table, one in front of her, one untouched across from her. Whoever had been sitting there was gone. My curiosity got the better of me. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but a server stopped by her table and asked softly if she needed anything else. The woman forced a smile and said, "No, thank you. I think I'm done here." Her voice sounded calm, but the disappointment underneath was impossible to miss. The server gave her a sympathetic look before walking away. I remember staring at my receipt, trying to convince myself that whatever happened at that table wasn't my business. After all, I didn't know her. I didn't know her story. But every time I looked toward the window, I saw the same lonely expression staring back at the rain. Then my order number was called. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. I was halfway there when something stopped me. To this day, I still can't fully explain it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was empathy. Maybe it was the memory of my own worst nights when I wished someone would simply sit down and remind me I wasn't alone. Whatever it was, I turned around and looked back at the woman by the window. And that's when I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of walking out, I set my takeout bag back on the counter and stood there for a few seconds arguing with myself. There is a thin line between being kind and being intrusive, and I had no idea which side I was about to step onto. She clearly came to the restaurant with someone. She clearly did not expect to leave alone. The last thing she probably wanted was a stranger interrupting her evening. But every time I looked toward that table, I remembered the quiet sound of someone trying not to cry behind a locked door. Before I could change my mind, my feet started moving. I crossed the dining room and stopped beside her table. Up close, she looked even more exhausted than she had from across the room. Not physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted. Like someone who had spent a long time carrying disappointment and had finally reached her limit. She looked up, surprised to see me standing there. For a second, I almost turned around and left. Then I smiled and asked the simplest question I could think of. She blinked a few times, clearly caught off guard. I quickly added that if she wanted to be alone, I would completely understand. To my relief, a small laugh escaped her lips. It was the first sign that maybe the evening was not beyond saving. She glanced at the empty chair across from her and gave a slight shrug. I took that as permission and sat down. For the first minute, neither of us knew what to say. The situation was unusual, and we both seemed aware of it. Finally, I introduced myself. Her name was Hannah. The moment she said it, something about it felt familiar, even though I was certain we had never met. We exchanged a few basic details. Nothing deep, nothing personal, just enough to ease the awkwardness. Then she looked at me with a curious expression and asked why I had come over. It was a fair question. I thought about giving some clever answer, but honesty felt easier. I told her she looked like she could use some company. Her eyes dropped toward the table. For a moment I worried I had embarrassed her. Then she smiled again, this time more genuinely. She admitted that company was probably exactly what she needed. The tension in her shoulders began to fade. We talked about the weather first, then traffic, then coffee shops, completely random subjects. Yet with every passing minute, the conversation became easier. Hannah had a quick sense of humor that seemed to appear whenever she forgot she was supposed to be having a bad night. More than once I caught her laughing before she immediately looked surprised at herself. It felt like watching sunlight break through heavy clouds. After nearly 20 minutes, I realized she had not checked her phone once. She had not looked toward the door. She had not mentioned the person who was supposed to be sitting across from her. And strangely enough, neither had I. But eventually her smile faded slightly, and she wrapped both hands around her water glass. Then she looked at me and said, "You are probably wondering what happened tonight." I nodded. Hannah took a slow breath, stared out at the rain beyond the window, and began to tell me a story I would never forget. Hannah let out a quiet breath and shook her head as if she still could not believe the night she had just experienced. She told me that a mutual friend had spent nearly a month convincing her to try a blind date. Apparently, this man had sounded perfect on paper. He had a stable career, similar interests, and according to everyone who knew him, he was thoughtful and mature. Hannah admitted she had resisted at first. Dating had not exactly been kind to her over the past few years. But eventually she agreed because she was tired of spending every Friday night grading papers at home. I smiled when she said that. There was something refreshingly honest about her. She was not trying to make herself sound impressive. She was simply telling the truth. To hear them. After she finished, silence settled over the table. Rain continued tapping against the window beside us. Finally, I asked her a question. If she could go back and cancel the date entirely, would she? Hannah thought about it for several seconds. Then she surprised me. She smiled and said no. I raised an eyebrow. She laughed and gestured toward me sitting across the table. Then she said that despite everything, the evening had become a lot more interesting than she ever expected. What she said next caught me completely off guard. She admitted that meeting a stranger who chose kindness over convenience was far more memorable than the date she had originally come for. And somehow, hearing those words affected me more than I wanted to admit. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Hannah's comment lingered between us, and I found myself looking away toward the rain-covered window. I was not used to hearing things like that. Most of my days were filled with meetings, deadlines, and conversations that revolved around goals and numbers. Genuine moments were rare. Unexpected moments were even rarer. Hannah seemed to notice my discomfort and smiled. "Do not worry," she said. "I am not trying to make this emotional." That made me laugh. "Too late," I replied. She laughed too, and for the first time that evening, the sadness that had followed her around seemed to disappear completely. The server eventually returned and asked whether we needed anything else. Hannah glanced at the menu and admitted she had been too nervous to order dinner before. I suggested we fix that. A few minutes later, we were sharing appetizers and talking like old friends who had known each other for years. The strange thing was how natural everything felt. There was no pressure, no awkward attempt to impress each other, no pretending to be someone we were not. Hannah told me she taught third grade at an elementary school north of the city. As she described her students, her entire face seemed to light up. She talked about their endless questions, their unpredictable honesty, and the small victories that most adults would overlook. Listening to her, I understood something important. She genuinely cared about people. It was not an act. It was simply who she was. In return, she asked what I did for a living. I hesitated for half a second before giving my usual answer. I told her I worked in business. Technically, it was true. It was also intentionally vague. She nodded and moved on without asking for details. Oddly enough, I appreciated that. Most people wanted titles, accomplishments, or financial information within the first 10 minutes of meeting someone. Hannah seemed far more interested in who a person was than what they did. As the evening continued, we drifted into deeper conversations. We talked about family, childhood memories, favorite places to travel, and the strange turns life sometimes takes. More than once, I caught myself forgetting that we were complete strangers. The restaurant slowly emptied around us. Tables were cleared. Conversations faded. Outside, the rain softened into a light drizzle. At one point, Hannah looked around the nearly empty dining room and laughed. "I cannot believe I almost went home an hour ago." "I am glad you did not," I said before I could stop myself. The words came out more honestly than I intended. Her expression softened. For a brief moment, neither of us looked away. Then she glanced down at her glass with a shy smile. Something shifted during that silence. Nothing dramatic. Nothing either of us acknowledged. But it was there. The feeling that this chance encounter might matter more than either of us understood. Then Hannah looked back up at me and asked a simple question. So what were you really doing here tonight? I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. Because the truth was far more complicated than she could possibly imagine. I smiled when Hannah asked the question, mostly because I was trying to buy myself a few extra seconds. The truth was complicated, but not for the reason most people would assume. I was not hiding some dramatic secret. I simply did not enjoy talking about work. Over the years, I had learned that the moment certain details entered a conversation, everything changed. People treated me differently. They asked different questions. Sometimes they even became different versions of themselves. I did not want that to happen with Hannah. Not tonight. So I leaned back in my chair and gave her a simplified version of the truth. I told her I had been meeting with a client earlier that evening and decided to grab dinner afterward. She nodded. Technically, it was accurate. The client meeting had just involved a company worth several $100 million. That part remained unspoken. That sounds much less exciting than I expected, Hannah said with a grin. Sorry to disappoint you. I was hoping for something dramatic, she replied. Maybe witness protection. Secret government missions. Something interesting. I laughed. I am afraid my life is much more boring than that. I do not believe you. Why not? Because people with boring lives do not walk across restaurants and rescue strangers from terrible dates. I shook my head. Rescue is a strong word. Maybe, but I still appreciate it. There was a sincerity in her voice that made me unexpectedly self-conscious. To change the subject, I asked what had inspired her to become a teacher. Her expression immediately brightened. She told me about a teacher she had when she was 9 years old. Someone who noticed she was struggling after her parents divorced and made sure she never felt alone. Hannah said that one person had changed the entire direction of her life. Since then, she had always wanted to do the same for someone else. As she spoke, I realized something. Most people spend years chasing success without ever defining what it means. Hannah had already figured it out. For her, success was helping people feel seen. It was simple, honest, and strangely inspiring. We continued talking long after the plates had been cleared from our table. At some point, the server brought the check and placed it near the edge of the table. Neither of us noticed for several minutes. We were discussing childhood dreams and all the strange ways adulthood rarely matches them. Hannah admitted she once thought she would become a famous novelist. I confessed that at 12 years old, I had wanted to play professional baseball despite having very little athletic talent. She laughed so hard she nearly spilled her water. The sound made me laugh too. By then, the restaurant was preparing to close. Employees were stacking chairs at empty tables. The evening had somehow slipped away from us. Hannah glanced at the time on her phone and her eyes widened. I cannot believe it is almost 10 o'clock. Neither could I. What was supposed to be a brief conversation had turned into nearly 3 hours. Then her smile softened. I guess this is where we go back to being strangers. For some reason, hearing those words bothered me more than it should have. The comment hung in the air between us. I looked at Hannah for a second longer than I probably should have, and something in her expression told me she regretted saying it the moment the words left her mouth. She laughed softly and shook her head. Sorry, that sounded more dramatic than I meant it to. Maybe a little, I said. Good. Then I can still pretend I am a normal person. I never thought you were anything else. For some reason, that answer stayed with me. Most people I met formed opinions within minutes. They looked at clothes, watches, job titles, neighborhoods, and 100 other meaningless details. Hannah had spent hours talking to me and somehow seemed interested only in the person sitting across from her. It was rare. Maybe that was why I found myself doing something I almost never did. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. What if we do not go back to being strangers? I asked. Her eyes widened slightly. Then a smile appeared. Not a polite smile. A genuine one. She took out her phone and handed it to me. We exchanged numbers, and suddenly something that had felt temporary began to feel real. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. We left the restaurant together a few minutes later. The cool night air greeted us as we stepped onto the sidewalk. Downtown Seattle shimmered under the reflections of streetlights and damp pavement. Hannah wrapped her light jacket a little tighter around herself. Her car was parked about half a block away. Mine was in the opposite direction. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, neither seeming eager to leave. It was strange. Just a few hours earlier we had been complete strangers. Now saying goodbye felt unexpectedly difficult. "Well," Hannah said, smiling. "Thank you for turning a terrible night into a surprisingly good one. Thank you for not telling me to leave when I interrupted your evening." She laughed. "Trust me, I considered it. I believe that." We stood there smiling at each other. Then she took a few steps backward toward her car. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Hannah." I watched her walk away before finally heading toward my own vehicle. During the drive home, I expected the evening to fade into the background like countless other random encounters over the years. It did not. Every red light seemed to bring another memory of our conversation. Every quiet stretch of road reminded me of her laugh. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I realized I was smiling for no reason. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I made coffee, checked emails, reviewed schedules, and attempted to focus on work. Attempted being the key word. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed on my desk. I glanced down. A message from Hannah. My heart reacted before my brain had time to process why. The text was simple. She had sent a picture of a classroom whiteboard covered with colorful drawings and a short message underneath. It read, "One of my students says this is what a perfect dragon looks like. I thought you should know." I laughed out loud in my office. Then I stared at the screen for several seconds before replying. What started as a chance meeting was beginning to feel like something neither of us had expected. Over the next few weeks, Hannah became part of my daily routine without either of us planning it. It started with simple messages. A funny story from her classroom. A picture of a poorly drawn animal one of her students insisted was a horse. A question about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. The conversations were effortless. Some lasted 5 minutes. Others stretched late into the evening. What surprised me most was how much I looked forward to them. My schedule remained as demanding as ever. Meetings filled my calendar. Flights appeared with little warning. Decisions that affected hundreds of employees waited for me every day. Yet somehow, in the middle of all that noise, a message from Hannah could immediately improve my mood. A week after we met, we had coffee together. A few days later, we met again for lunch. Then came a walk along the waterfront on a Saturday afternoon. Nothing felt rushed. Neither of us talked about defining the relationship or where things were heading. We simply enjoyed being around each other. Looking back, I think that was part of what made it special. There was no performance, no pressure, just two people learning who the other person really was. Hannah remained exactly who she had been the night we met. Kind, honest, thoughtful. She remembered small details that most people forgot. If I mentioned an important meeting, she would ask how it went. If I complained about not sleeping enough, she would remind me to take care of myself. The more time I spent with her, the more I realized how rare that kind of attention was. One Saturday morning, she invited me to a community book fair where several local schools were participating. I arrived expecting a small event. Instead, hundreds of families filled the area. Children ran between booths carrying stacks of books almost as tall as they were. The moment Hannah arrived, everything changed. Parents greeted her. Students ran over to hug her. Teachers waved from across the parking lot. I spent the next 2 hours watching person after person light up when they saw her. That was when I truly understood the impact she had on people. She was not famous. She was not wealthy. But she made people feel important. That kind of influence cannot be measured on a balance sheet. At one point, a little girl tugged on Hannah's sleeve and asked if I was her boyfriend. Hannah nearly dropped the books she was carrying. I laughed while she turned bright red. The child waited patiently for an answer. Hannah smiled awkwardly and explained that we were friends. The girl nodded as if evaluating the information. Then she looked at me and said, "You should probably fix that." Before either of us could respond, she ran away. Hannah covered her face while laughing. I laughed too, but the truth was that the question stayed with me long after the event ended. Because for the first time, I found myself wondering whether friendship was really all I wanted. The problem was that there was still one important thing Hannah did not know about me, and the longer I waited to tell her, the more complicated it was becoming. For weeks, I kept telling myself I would explain everything to Hannah. Every time we met, I planned to bring it up. Every time the opportunity appeared, I found a reason to postpone it. Part of me justified the delay by insisting that my job should not matter. I wanted her to know me, not my title. But another part of me knew the truth. The longer I waited, the more it started to look like I was hiding something. Unfortunately, life decided to solve the problem for me. One Tuesday afternoon, Hannah sent me a message asking whether I wanted to meet for coffee after work. I was about to reply when my phone rang. An unexpected issue at the company required my immediate attention. A major partnership announcement had been moved forward, and suddenly my entire evening disappeared. I apologized to Hannah and promised we would reschedule. She was understanding, as always. The next morning, I arrived at the office before sunrise. The day became a blur of interviews, meetings, and press events. By noon, I had completely forgotten that several local news outlets were covering the announcement. Meanwhile, Hannah was spending her lunch break in the teacher's lounge at school. I learned later that another teacher had been scrolling through an online business article when she suddenly stopped and stared at her screen. Then she looked at Hannah and asked a simple question. "Is this your Ethan?" Hannah reportedly laughed and said there were probably thousands of people named Ethan. Then she looked at the article herself. There was my picture. There was my full name. And there was an entire story about the company I had founded. By the time I checked my phone that evening, I already knew something was wrong. Hannah had not responded to my last message. That alone was unusual. Then I noticed a short text that had arrived hours earlier. It simply read, "I think we need to talk." My stomach dropped. We met the following evening at a small park near the waterfront. The moment I saw her, I knew the situation was worse than I had hoped. She was not angry. She was disappointed. Somehow that felt much harder to face. We sat on a bench overlooking the water. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Hannah looked at me. "Why did you not tell me?" she asked quietly. I started explaining that I never intended to deceive her. I told her I wanted a chance to be treated normally. I told her I liked the version of our relationship that existed before titles and assumptions entered the picture. Everything I said was true, but as I spoke, I could see the hurt in her eyes. "You had so many chances," she said. "Do you know what makes this difficult? It is not who you are. It is the fact that you decided I did not deserve the truth." Her words hit harder than any criticism I had received in years. Because deep down, I knew she had a point. Then Hannah stood up, looked out across the water, and said something that made my heart sink. She told me she needed time to think about whether she could trust me again. The next few days felt longer than they should have. Hannah did not block me. She did not disappear completely. But the easy rhythm we had built together was gone. Our messages became shorter. The warmth that had once filled every conversation seemed buried beneath uncertainty. I could not blame her. Trust is difficult to earn and easy to damage. The more I thought about our conversation by the waterfront, the more I realized that Hannah had never been upset about my success. She had been hurt by my silence. For the first time in a long time, I stopped looking for the perfect explanation and started focusing on the simple truth. A week later, I received an invitation from Hannah's school to attend a community reading event. One of the teachers I had met at the book fair had reached out after hearing that our company supported literacy programs. Normally, I would have sent a representative. This time I accepted personally. The event took place on a bright Saturday morning. Families filled the gymnasium. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, holding books. Volunteers moved between tables covered with colorful displays. As I walked inside, I spotted Hannah across the room helping a group of students organize a reading activity. For a moment, I simply watched. She was smiling, encouraging, patient, completely focused on the children around her. It reminded me of everything that had drawn me to her in the first place. Not her appearance, not the circumstances of how we met. Her heart. When the event ended, parents and students gradually began leaving. Eventually, Hannah found me, standing near the exit. She looked surprised, but not unhappy to see me. We stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I told her something I should have said much earlier. I told her that meeting her had become one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. I admitted that I had been afraid. Not afraid she would judge me for who I was, but afraid that everything between us would change once she knew. I explained that my mistake was deciding that fear for both of us instead of trusting her with the truth. Hannah listened quietly. When I finished, she looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. I could see tears forming, but she was smiling. Then she said something I will never forget. She said that trust is not built when everything is easy. Trust is built when people choose honesty even when honesty feels risky. I nodded because she was right. Completely right. We stood there talking for nearly an hour. By the end of the conversation, the distance between us felt gone. Not because I had convinced her, because we had finally been honest with each other. 1 year later, we returned to the same restaurant where everything began. We sat near the same window. Rain tapped softly against the glass, just like it had that night. Hannah laughed as we talked about how unlikely our story sounded. Then I reached into my pocket, took a deep breath, and asked her to spend the rest of her life with me. She said yes before I could finish speaking. Sometimes people spend years searching for the right person. I found mine because of a random decision on a rainy evening. The best thing that happened that night was never finding an empty chair at her table. It was finding the person who would eventually become my home.